The hotel lobby went silent when the clerk looked up and said my name. "I'm sorry, Miss Walker. I can't find your reservation." Behind me, my sister's heels clicked closer as she smiled and said loudly, "We only made reservations for our real family." My parents turned their backs like they didn't hear a thing. They thought I'd panic, beg, sleep on the couch. What they didn't know was that while they were checking into their rooms, I was about to make one decision that would turn this trip, and our family, upside down. When my parents announced the family trip, everyone else reacted with excitement. Smiles. Plans. Group chats filled with hotel photos and itinerary ideas. I smiled too, but mine didn't reach very far. Something in my chest tightened the moment I heard the word trip. Family vacations had never been relaxing for me, they were performances I was expected to survive quietly. Growing up, trips always magnified what daily life tried to hide. Who mattered? Who was tolerated? Who was included by default, and who had to earn their place repeatedly? I'd learned to pack light emotionally, not just physically. Expectations only led to disappointment. Still, I said yes. I always did. Saying no only created more tension, more whispered conversations I wasn't part of. Agreeing felt easier than explaining why I hesitated. Besides, this trip was supposed to be different. That's what my mother said. "We're all adults now. Let's just enjoy ourselves." I wanted to believe her. As plans took shape, I noticed how information reached me last. Flight details came through secondhand. Room discussions happened without me. When I asked questions, answers were vague. "Don't worry, it's handled." That phrase followed me everywhere, like reassurance meant to quiet curiosity rather than offer clarity. The closer the trip got, the heavier the feeling became. Not fear exactly, recognition. The kind that comes from pattern. I'd been here before, emotionally. Standing close enough to feel included, far enough to be forgotten. I packed anyway. Folded clothes. Checked dates. Booked my time off work. Part of me hoped I was wrong this time. That I was overthinking. That maybe this would finally feel like what family trips were supposed to feel like. But another part of me, the quieter, more honest part, knew better. It knew that trips don't change dynamics. They expose them. By the time we boarded the plane, I wasn't excited. I was alert. Watching. Preparing myself for something I couldn't yet name, but instinctively understood was coming. I just didn't know how public it would be. Or how far they were willing to go. That I didn't need this trip to remind me where I stood in my family. I'd known for years, I just hadn't always had the words for it. Growing up, the differences were subtle enough to be denied, but consistent enough to be felt. Praise was selective. Patience was conditional. I learned early that I wasn't measured by the same standards as everyone else. My siblings were celebrated for meeting expectations. I was scrutinized for exceeding or missing them. When they spoke, they were listened to. When I spoke, I was corrected. If I succeeded, it was luck. If I struggled, it was proof. Over time, I became the quiet one, not because I had nothing to say, but because speaking never changed the outcome. Family gatherings followed a familiar rhythm. Jokes landed at my expense, always framed as harmless. Advice came unsolicited, usually in public. My parents insisted they were just trying to help, but help never felt like this. It felt like being managed instead of supported. I adapted. I became self-sufficient early. Learned not to ask for much. Learned that independence was safer than reliance. When something good happened in my life, I shared it cautiously, already bracing for skepticism. When something went wrong, I handled it alone. The hardest part wasn't the treatment itself, it was how invisible it was to everyone else. Anytime I tried to explain, I was told I was being sensitive. Dramatic. Unfair. The conversation always ended with me apologizing for bringing it up at all. So I stopped. I told myself this was just how families worked. That roles were fixed, and mine happened to be the difficult one. I convinced myself that acceptance came from endurance, not boundaries. That if I stayed agreeable long enough, things might eventually shift. But they never did. By the time this trip was planned, I wasn't surprised by being left out of decisions. I was used to being the afterthought. What unsettled me was how comfortable they seemed with it, how normal exclusion had become. That comfort would soon be tested. Because patterns don't stay invisible forever. Sometimes, they reveal themselves in front of strangers, under bright lights, with nowhere left to hide. This trip wasn't just a vacation to my family. It was a statement. A chance to be seen exactly how they wanted to be seen, successful, united, enviable. My parents talked about it like an achievement, not a getaway. The destination was chosen carefully. The hotel even more so. Everything had to look impressive. They mentioned who might see the photos. Friends. Distant relatives. People whose opinions mattered more than comfort. My mother spoke about outfits and dinners. My father talked about the lobby, the views, the reputation of the place. This trip was about appearance, not rest. That explained why controls suddenly tightened. Plans weren't discussed, they were announced. Suggestions weren't invited. Any attempt to contribute was brushed aside. We've already handled it. Trust us. Don't complicate things. I recognized the tone. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about authority. I noticed how often my name was missing from sentences. We booked. We decided. We're doing. I existed on the edges of their planning, included only when it was convenient to remember me. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't need to be involved in every detail. But the more they talked, the clearer it became, this trip was curated. And curated things don't leave room for variables. For people who don't fit neatly into the picture being presented. I started to feel like an accessory, useful when needed, invisible when not. Someone who could be brought along without being accounted for. The idea unsettled me, but I pushed it down. Questioning things too much always came with consequences. So I stayed quiet. Observed. Took mental notes. If this trip was meant to showcase who mattered, I was already seeing where I fell on that list. They wanted perfection. Control. A flawless narrative. And in narratives like that, inconvenient details are often erased. I didn't yet realize how literal that erasure would become. But looking back, the signs were all there. The hotel rose out of the city like something unreal, glass, marble, soft lighting that made everyone look important. As we pulled up, staff moved with practiced ease, opening doors, greeting my parents by name. My mother straightened her posture immediately. My father smiled like he belonged there. I followed a step behind, rolling my suitcase across the polished floor. The lobby smelled expensive. Everything was quiet in that intentional way, where even footsteps sounded curated. Guests spoke in low voices, dressed like they were part of the decor. This was exactly the kind of place my family loved, beautiful, impressive, and unforgiving. At the front desk, my parents stepped forward confidently. My sister stood beside them, already scrolling on her phone. I waited slightly back, assuming I'd be included when the clerk asked for details. That's how it always went. I was present, just not centered. The clerk smiled warmly and asked for the last name. My father answered. Keys were prepared. Confirmations were reviewed. Room upgrades were discussed casually, like bonuses they'd earned just by arriving. I watched quietly, feeling a familiar distance settle in. Then the clerk asked how many keys were needed. There was a pause. A small one. Barely noticeable. My mother answered quickly, naming everyone, except me. I waited for a correction. A glance. Something. Nothing came. I felt it then. Not panic. Not yet. Just a shift. Like standing on a floor that suddenly felt less solid. I stepped forward slightly, ready to say my name, assuming it was a simple oversight. The clerk looked at me and smiled politely, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "And you?" she asked. That question hung in the air longer than it should have. My parents didn't respond right away. My sister avoided my eyes. The silence stretched, thin and sharp, drawing attention from nearby guests. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. Whatever was happening had been decided long before we reached the lobby. And I was about to find out just how intentional it was. The clerk looked between us, waiting. Her smile stayed in place, but her eyes flicked briefly toward my parents, searching for confirmation. I gave a small, uncertain smile of my own, still hoping someone would speak up and fix whatever this was. No one did. My mother cleared her throat and said, calmly, "She won't be needing a room." The words landed softly, like they were nothing. Like they didn't carry weight. Like they hadn't just pulled the ground out from under me. The clerk paused, fingers still. "I'm sorry," she said gently, "so there's no reservation under her name?" She glanced at me again, confused now. Concerned. My father sighed, the way he did when he thought someone was being difficult. "We're all sharing," he said vaguely. "It's fine." He didn't look at me when he said it. Sharing. I looked at the keys on the counter, 3 envelopes. 3 rooms. None of them mine. I felt heat rise to my face as people behind us shifted, waiting their turn. The lobby suddenly felt much smaller. My sister leaned in and said, loud enough for the clerk to hear, she didn't really need one anyway. There was a smile in her voice. Enjoyment. That was when it clicked. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't about saving money or logistics. This was deliberate. Planned. Decided somewhere without me. The clerk looked uncomfortable now. She turned to me and asked quietly, "Would you like me to check availability?" It was kind. Professional. And somehow, that made it worse. I opened my mouth, then closed it. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. I knew exactly what they expected, to scramble, to ask, to make it awkward so they could blame me for the scene. I didn't give them that. I shook my head and said, "No, thank you." My voice was steady, even though my hands weren't. The clerk nodded, relief mixed with confusion, and handed the keys to my parents. They took them without hesitation. As they turned away, luggage rolling toward the elevators, my mother said over her shoulder, "We'll figure something out later." Later. Like my dignity was a scheduling issue. I stood there alone for a moment, the lobby noise washing back in, and realized something important. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd decided I didn't matter enough to plan for. And that realization changed everything. That we hadn't even reached the elevators when my sister laughed. Not awkwardly. Not nervously. It was light, casual, like this was all entertainment to her. She glanced back at me and said, "You're always so dramatic. You'll figure it out." I stopped walking. The words weren't loud, but they were sharp. They landed harder than anything else that had happened so far. Not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. Like being left without a room was an inconvenience I'd created for myself. My parents kept moving. My father pretended not to hear. My mother didn't turn around. That silence felt like agreement. I looked at my sister and saw something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't accidental cruelty. It was comfort. She was comfortable knowing I'd be inconvenienced, embarrassed, forced to adjust. Comfortable because it wasn't happening to her. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. You can crash on the couch or something. It's just a couple nights. Her tone was almost helpful. Almost kind. Like she was offering a solution instead of acknowledging the problem she helped create. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger. Clarity. I realized they hadn't just failed to include me. They had assumed I would absorb the consequences quietly, like I always had. That I'd make myself smaller to preserve their comfort. That I'd apologize for existing in their space. I didn't respond to her. I didn't argue. I didn't ask where, exactly, I was supposed to sleep. I just nodded once and stepped back. She rolled her eyes and followed our parents toward the elevators, satisfied the situation was handled. I stood there watching them disappear, the polished doors closing behind them, and understood something with unsettling calm. They believed this was normal. They believed I would adapt. And they believed wrong. Because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to survive the trip. I was thinking about how to end it, on my terms. That I stood there for a few seconds longer than necessary, letting the quiet settle in my chest. Anyone watching might have expected a reaction, tears, anger, raised voices. That's what scenes are made of. That's what they were counting on. But none of that came. I didn't cry because I wasn't surprised. Hurt, yes. Humiliated, absolutely. But shocked? No. This was just the loudest version of something they'd been doing quietly for years. Crying would have meant I still believed they'd care enough to stop. I didn't argue because arguments had never changed anything before. They only gave my family something to point at later. Proof that I was difficult. Unstable. Too much. I wasn't interested in feeding that story anymore. Instead, I breathed. Slow. Controlled. I focused on the cool air of the lobby, the solid floor beneath my feet. I reminded myself that reactions are currency, and I wasn't handing mine over for free. As I walked away from the desk, I felt eyes on me. Curiosity. Pity. Judgment. It all blended together. Normally, that would have crushed me. This time, it didn't. Something steadier took its place. Resolve. I realized that the power dynamic had always depended on my emotional response. When I reacted, they led. When I stayed calm, the script broke. And right there, surrounded by strangers, I decided I wasn't playing my old role anymore. I didn't need to prove I was hurt. I didn't need to explain why this was wrong. Anyone with basic decency could see it. And anyone who couldn't wasn't going to change their mind anyway. So instead of following them upstairs, I stepped outside. The city noise hit me immediately, cars, voices, life continuing like nothing had happened. I pulled out my phone, not to call a friend or vent, but to make a decision. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't look dramatic at first, but changes everything after. They thought leaving me without a room would break me. What they didn't know was that I just stopped reacting. And when you stop reacting, you start choosing. That I stepped a few feet away from the entrance, just far enough that the glass doors closed behind me and softened the noise of the lobby. My reflection stared back at me, calm on the outside, steady in a way I hadn't expected. I scrolled through my contacts and stopped on a name I hadn't used in months. The hotel's management office. I'd saved the number back when the trip was first mentioned, not because I planned to use it, but because experience had taught me to be prepared. I pressed call and waited, listening to the ring, my pulse finally slowing instead of racing. When someone answered, I spoke clearly. I gave my name. Explained the situation without emotion. No accusations. No story. Just facts. I said I was part of the group that had booked rooms under my family name, but I'd just been informed there was no accommodation assigned to me. There was a pause on the other end. The kind that tells you someone is checking records carefully. Typing. Reading. Processing. I stayed quiet and let the silence work. Then the voice came back, more attentive than before. Polite, but alert. They asked a few questions: dates, booking reference, payment details. I answered each one calmly. Precisely. I didn't rush. What my family didn't know was that I'd covered a significant portion of the booking myself. Quietly. Months earlier. It wasn't a favor. It was an arrangement, agreed upon without my parents' involvement. Something I'd done because it made sense at the time. The person on the phone confirmed it. I could hear the shift immediately. Authority replaced confusion. "Please give me a moment," they said. I waited. Standing there, phone pressed to my ear, I felt something unfamiliar. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Control. When they returned, their tone was firm and respectful. They said they'd handle it internally and asked me to stay where I was for a few minutes. I thanked them and ended the call. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked up at the building. My family thought this trip was already decided. They thought there was nothing I could do. They were wrong. And in just a few minutes, they were going to find out exactly how wrong they were. What my family never bothered to ask was how this trip had actually been arranged. They assumed everything had gone through my parents, credit cards, confirmations, decisions. That assumption was convenient. It kept the narrative simple. It also happened to be wrong. Months earlier, when the idea of the trip was first floated, I'd offered to help coordinate. Not out of excitement, but out of habit. I handled logistics at work every day. I knew how easily things fell apart when too many people assumed someone else was responsible. So I took on a portion quietly. Flights were booked separately, but the hotel was different. I'd put my name on the reservation alongside theirs. I'd paid a significant deposit directly, transferred through my account, not theirs. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't secretive. It just wasn't something they paid attention to. They never asked for details because they never expected me to matter in them. The booking confirmation had come to my email as well as my father's. I'd read it carefully when it arrived, noticing how flexible the arrangement was, how much authority rested with whoever was listed as a primary contact. I remembered thinking it was smart, just in case plans changed. Standing outside the hotel now, that memory felt less like coincidence and more like instinct. I hadn't planned this outcome. But I had prepared for possibilities. Inside, my family was probably settling into their rooms, laughing, assuming the uncomfortable part was over. They believed the worst had passed because I hadn't made a scene. They thought silence meant surrender. They didn't know the system was still open. That changes could still be made. That their certainty rested on an oversight they'd created themselves. I watched guests move in and out of the lobby, unaware of the quiet recalibration happening behind the scenes. Staff walked with purpose now. Phones rang. Screens refreshed. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had burned off, leaving something sharper behind: focus. For the first time on this trip, I wasn't reacting to what my family had done. I was acting on what I knew. And once systems start moving, they don't stop just because someone assumed they were untouchable. That assumption was about to cost them more than embarrassment. It was about to cost them comfort that I was just stepping back inside when I saw the shift happen. It started subtly. The front desk staff straightened, conversations lowered, and a man in a tailored suit emerged from behind a frosted glass door. The hotel manager. Calm. Focused. Purposeful. He approached the desk, spoke briefly with the clerk, then scanned the lobby. His eyes landed on me almost immediately. Not by accident. By instruction. He walked over with a professional smile and asked if I was the guest who had just called. I nodded. "Thank you for waiting," he said. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding with the booking." The word misunderstanding carried weight. It drew attention. Nearby guests slowed. Staff paused. And from across the lobby, I saw my parents step out of the elevator area, keys in hand, mid-conversation. The manager continued, voice even but clear. "Several changes were made to the reservation this afternoon. Unfortunately, the room assignments currently issued are no longer valid." My father frowned and stepped forward. "What do you mean, no longer valid?" His tone had edge now. Authority challenged. The manager didn't flinch. "The booking was partially authorized and funded by another registered guest," he said, gesturing gently toward me. "That guest has requested an adjustment." Silence spread fast. My mother's face drained. My sister froze, her confidence evaporating in real time. My father opened his mouth, then closed it again, recalculating. The manager continued, unfazed. "As of now, the reservation has been modified. We'll need to reassign rooms accordingly." He paused, then added, "We'll also need to verify payment for the remaining accommodations." That was when it landed. They hadn't just excluded me. They had assumed control they didn't actually have. And now, in front of strangers, staff, and witnesses, that assumption was collapsing. My mother tried to speak, something about confusion, about family, but the manager held up a hand politely. "We'll resolve this professionally," he said. "Please step back to the desk." I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. As staff began collecting key cards, my family stood there stunned, watching something they believed was settled unravel completely. Their certainty had been built on my silence. And now that silence was working against them. I felt a strange calm settle in my chest, not pride, not anger. Finality. Because this wasn't about embarrassment anymore. It was about accountability. And once authority shifts in a public space like that, there's no pretending it didn't happen. No laughing it off. No rewriting the story later. The hotel manager's announcement had changed the trip. But more than that, it had changed the balance between us. And everyone in that lobby could see it, the confidence drained from my family's faces faster than I thought possible. My father started talking all at once, asking questions, demanding explanations, insisting there had been some mistake. His voice rose with every sentence, the control he relied on slipping further away. My mother tried a different approach. She smiled tightly, touched the manager's arm, and said there must be confusion. That we were a family. That things could be sorted out privately. The manager listened politely, unmoved. Policies didn't bend for tone or familiarity. My sister stood back, eyes darting between staff members, guests, and me. The smugness she'd worn earlier was gone. In its place was something rawer, fear. Fear of losing comfort. Of being inconvenienced. Of suddenly not being protected. Around us, people pretended not to stare. Pretended not to listen. But everyone noticed. Keys were being recollected. Screens were being updated. Staff moved with purpose. The lobby buzzed with quiet tension. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Then again. I didn't check it. I didn't need to. I could already hear what the messages would say, confusion turning into urgency, urgency turning into desperation. My father finally looked at me. Really looked at me. Not as a problem to manage, not as someone to dismiss, but as the person who now held leverage. His expression shifted, just slightly, like he was seeing me clearly for the first time. I met his gaze calmly. No smile. No anger. just steadiness. That was when panic truly set in. Because panic doesn't come from losing control, it comes from realizing you never had it to begin with. My family had built this entire trip on assumptions. On habits. On the belief that I would always adjust, absorb, and stay quiet. Now, with staff waiting and other guests watching, they were scrambling to fix something they never thought could turn against them. And the hardest part for them wasn't the inconvenience. It was the exposure. The realization that the version of me they'd relied on, the one who fixed things for them without being acknowledged, was gone. And there was no one left to smooth this over. The shift in their tone was almost immediate. Panic softened into politeness. Politeness into concern. My mother was the first to try. She stepped closer, lowering her voice like this was suddenly a private family matter instead of a public unraveling. "Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be," she said, carefully. "We can talk upstairs." The suggestion was familiar: remove witnesses, regain control, rewrite the moment later. I didn't respond. My father followed quickly, his voice calmer now, almost reasonable. He said there must have been a misunderstanding. That no one meant for things to go this far. He said families don't treat each other this way, as if the last hour hadn't happened exactly because they had. My sister finally spoke, her earlier confidence completely gone. "We didn't think it would be a big deal," she said. "You know how things get when we travel." The words sounded rehearsed, like she was searching for something that would reset the situation. None of them apologized for not booking me a room. They apologized for the consequences. For the scene. For the inconvenience. For the discomfort of being exposed. Every sentence was framed around fixing this, not acknowledging that. Their remorse moved too quickly, too smoothly, like a reflex triggered by loss of control. I listened without interrupting. Not because I agreed, but because I wanted to hear how far they'd go without being prompted. How much responsibility they'd actually take. It wasn't much. No one said my name with sincerity. No one admitted the decision had been deliberate. No one asked how it felt to stand alone at the desk while they checked in without me. Those details were inconvenient now. What they wanted was resolution without accountability. Comfort without reflection. A return to normal, only now with me quietly absorbing the fallout again. I realized then that their apologies weren't about me. They were about restoring order. And for the first time, I understood something clearly: accepting these apologies would put me right back where I started. Back in the role that made all of this possible. So I didn't accept them. I let the silence do the work instead. Because silence, when it's chosen, speaks louder than forgiveness ever could. The lobby felt different once I stopped engaging. The noise softened, like the room itself was waiting to see what I would do next. My family stood close, but for the first time, their presence didn't press in on me. I felt oddly separate, untethered from their expectations. I realized I didn't owe them a response. Not reassurance. Not forgiveness. Not even anger. I had spent years explaining myself, adjusting my boundaries so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable. This moment didn't require explanation. It required a decision. I turned toward the manager instead. Calmly. Clearly. I confirmed the updated reservation and thanked him for handling it professionally. He nodded, already moving to finalize things. The transaction felt clean, impersonal, exactly what I needed. Behind me, I could feel my family's confusion deepen. They'd expected negotiation. An argument. Tears. Something familiar they could manage. Instead, they were watching me step out of the pattern entirely. My sister whispered my name, sharp with urgency. I didn't turn around. Because choosing myself didn't look dramatic. It didn't involve raised voices or ultimatums. It looked like calm follow-through. like respecting my own boundaries even when it made others uncomfortable. I picked up my bag and walked a few steps away from them. Not far, just enough to create space that hadn't existed before. Space I hadn't allowed myself. In that distance, something settled inside me. A sense of alignment. Of finally acting in a way that matched how I felt. I wasn't trying to punish them. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was protecting myself. That realization was quiet but powerful. It reframed everything. This wasn't revenge. It was self-respect arriving late, but staying for good. When I looked back, my parents were speaking to staff again, their voices low, their posture uncertain. They no longer looked like people in charge. They looked like people reacting. And I understood something else in that moment. I didn't need their approval to move forward. I didn't need their acknowledgement to know my worth. I had already stepped into it. And once you choose yourself in a moment like that, there's no going back to the version of you that tolerated less. That I didn't stay to see how they fixed it. I didn't wait for a new plan or a compromise. Once the arrangements were finalized, I thanked the manager again and walked toward the exit, my footsteps steady, my chest lighter than it had been all day. Outside, the air was cool and quiet, a sharp contrast to the tension I'd left behind. I sat on a low wall near the entrance and took a slow breath, realizing how exhausted I'd been, not from travel, but from years of carrying expectations that weren't mine. My phone buzzed again. Messages stacked up quickly now. Calls I didn't answer. I wasn't avoiding them out of spite. I just needed space to let the moment land. To feel what it meant to finally choose myself without immediately backtracking. I booked my own place nearby. Smaller. Simple. Mine. When the confirmation came through, I felt a sense of control return, not over them, but over my own experience. That mattered more than any room upgrade ever could. Later, as I settled into my quiet space, I imagined my family navigating the rest of the trip without me smoothing things over. Without the buffer I'd always been. They would have to deal with each other directly now, the frustrations, the logistics, the consequences. That thought didn't bring satisfaction. It brought relief. Because distance, I realized, can be an act of care. For yourself. Sometimes even for others. Stepping away doesn't always mean abandonment. Sometimes it's the only way to stop enabling patterns that hurt everyone involved. I spent that evening walking along the street, watching the city lights come on one by one. The trip I'd imagined hadn't happened. But something better had. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't adjusting myself to fit into a space that didn't consider me. The trip continued, yes. Just not in the way they expected. And for the first time, that didn't feel like loss. It felt like freedom. When the trip ended, I returned home with fewer photos and no shared memories to scroll through. But I carried something heavier and far more permanent, a clear understanding of where I stood and what I would no longer accept. The distance that followed wasn't dramatic. There were no big confrontations or final speeches. Just quieter conversations. Shorter calls. Boundaries that stayed in place even when they were tested. Especially then. My family eventually reached out again, as families do. They spoke carefully now. Asked more questions. Left more space. Not because they had suddenly changed, but because they knew I had. And that knowledge altered the way they approached me. I didn't rebuild things the way they were. I rebuilt them differently. On terms that didn't require me to disappear for the sake of harmony. On terms that recognized my presence as something valuable, not optional. Looking back, the moment that shifted everything wasn't the hotel lobby or the reservation changes. It was the instant I decided my comfort mattered as much as anyone else's. That I didn't need permission to protect my dignity. That realization followed me home and settled into my daily life. In work. In friendships. In the way I spoke up when something didn't feel right. The ripple effect was subtle but powerful. I no longer waited to be included. I included myself. And when I think about that trip now, I don't think about being left without a room. I think about the clarity it gave me. The boundary it forced me to draw. The version of myself that walked away instead of shrinking. Some lessons come wrapped in discomfort. Some arrive disguised as rejection. But if you listen closely, they're offering you something. Not revenge. Not victory. Freedom. And once you take that with you, you never really come back the same.